Hello and welcome to this lesson in chapter 13, the Energy and Ecosystems chapter, on the use of fertilisers and the damage they can potentially cause to our environment. Now I'm making an assumption here that you've already done the theory on cycles, that you know how cycles work, that you understand the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle from the A-level content, and you also understand the carbon cycle and the water cycle from the GCSE content. So we're going to take a very much more applied view here as we talk about environmental damages, application and agriculture. So this is the syllabus, as you can see here. The top bit I'm hoping that you have an understanding of already, and it's the bit in the bottom that we're going to be looking at specifically, the use of natural and artificial fertilisers to replace the nitrates and phosphates lost by harvesting plants and removing livestock, and the environmental issues arising. So, as a quick summary, all cycles ultimately boil down to this, okay? That an inorganic compound becomes an organic compound at some point. That stage is called fixing, and that later in the cycle, that organic compound, maybe having moved through many living things, goes back to becoming an inorganic compound. That's called decomposition. And things that fix inorganic material to organic material are called the producers, and things that put it back the other way are called the decomposers. And that rule works for whatever nutrient you happen to be following around a cycle at the time. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're talking about nitrogen or phosphorus, magnesium, or calcium, iron. It doesn't matter at all, right? That's what the broad brushstrokes are. For specifics, see some other lessons. So, what nutrients are we talking about here when we talk about cycles? What are you actually made of in what proportion? Well, the inorganic molecules we refer to as nutrients, okay? And they're grouped as what we call the major nutrients, the molecules containing carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and they make up more than 99% of the biomass on the planet. Which sounds surprising until you start to think a little bit. Well, hang on. Things like cellulose, which make all cell walls, are just made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Proteins are primarily made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen with one other additional element, which is going to come in next. All our carbohydrates, all our fats are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. The macronutrients, the molecules containing nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, phosphorus, calcium and magnesium, make up 0.5%. So all those really, really important things. I mean, how much did your parents tell you when you were a little kid that you need to get your calcium or else you won't grow properly? All those things are less than 0.5% of biomass. And then we go to micro or trace elements, which are all the other things that you need in your diet, right, or in living things. So, for example, I don't see sodium there. A little bit of sodium, iron to make hemoglobin in mammals, very important. So on, copper is in there if you want to make your version of hemocyanin or a version of hemoglobin in crustaceans, for example. These collectively are what we refer to as minerals. And again, you are not an exception to this. Your body follows this same rules. And in fact, I have dressed for this lesson. I have come with an ingredients list. Here we are. So you may have seen t-shirts like this that tell you what you are made of. So just in case anyone needs any nutritional information on their biology teacher, you can see what elements I'm made of. The largest one being oxygen at 61%, followed by carbon, 22, hydrogen, 10, nitrogen. Now that broadly follows the same pattern, that we're up to sort of the 90s for those big major nutrients. But remember, the plus 99 stat there includes all the plants and various other things that are made far more heavily of things like cellulose and lignin. Okay, so you can get yourself your own ingredients list from any reputable internet supplier. So if something is missing and it limits the growth, regardless of what category that's in, we call it a limiting factor. So the growth of producers usually is limited by the availability of the little ones. Normally it's not the major nutrients that are in short supply, it's the little ones that actually limit the growth, which is why nitrates and nitrogen and phosphorus in the form of nitrates and phosphates are what's on your syllabus. Okay, that's why they're there, because they're often limiting factors to producing food effectively for us. Okay, so I'll give you an example of where a really, really, really minor nutrient can have a massive impact on biomass, and that's iron. Now this was a theory touted a while ago as a way of preventing global warming. Okay, so we could basically it was spotted we could massively increase the growth of algae in the North Atlantic by adding tiny quantities of iron. Turns out what was stopping algae growing far more was a lack of available iron in the water. Okay, and now obviously if the algae grow a lot more, they will take in an awful lot of carbon out of the atmosphere in the form of doing photosynthesis. Brilliant. It was found that 5 micrograms, okay, 5 micrograms per cubic meter, right? So that's per ton of water, is enough to cause a huge algal bloom, is to cause an explosion in the amount of algae that grows that way. Okay, what's the logic? Why would we want to do this? Well, basically, a little bit more iron, right, relatively cheap. I mean, because you can take tons and tons of iron powder out in a single trawler and go and sprinkle it in the water, not a problem. Means masses more algae. The theory went like this: more algae, more photosynthesis, more carbon dioxide fixed, reduced global warming. Okay, so we're messing in this case with the iron cycle as a minor nutrient to try and reduce global warming. And did it work? No, of course it didn't. Because cycles have a way of pushing back, right? These are not linear reactions. So of course all that happened was they tested this, sent a trawler out with iron up near Iceland. It was just started dumping just south of Iceland. Sure enough, there was a big algal bloom. All that happened was a load of things that eat algae, higher animals, therefore do lots and lots of respiration, turned up to eat the algae. And then a lot of bigger things turned up to eat the things that were eating the algae, and immediately all this chasing around and feeding just put the carbon dioxide straight back in the atmosphere through the medium of respiration. Okay, the carbon wasn't locked away, and all it did was muck up a bunch of seagoing creatures' migratory routes as they all diverted to south of Iceland to get this massive feeding frenzy that had turned up because of this iron enrichment. So essentially they took this kind of area of the world, at the top here, sort of between the UK, there's a tip of Greenland there, Iceland up there, and North America, and made a bit of it look like that. Delightful. Okay, so it wasn't that simple, but the theory worked. Okay, now why are they so important? Right? Why are these limiting factors so important? Well, basically, the reduction or removal of limiting factors in the most cost-effective way is one way to define farming. Right, it's one way to define food production. Because, as we've said, the major nutrients are actually, in most parts of the world, quite plentiful. Okay, water, carbon dioxide, light are quite plentiful. And even where there's no water, people have been working on irrigation systems for thousands, tens of thousands of years. Okay, there's all sorts of evidence of irrigation channels from ancient history. So these major nutrients have kind of been, been all right. Okay, and light, well, we're not really short of light unless you happen to live in the high Arctic in winter. They're quite plentiful. It's the other stuff that actually holds back the animals, holds back the plants, and therefore the animals in terms of their growth. If you remove those limiting factors, for quite a small input, you can get quite a large increase in yield. And what's on the screen at the moment over here is a picture where a farmer hadn't realised that their fertiliser had run out. So they were strafing up and down the fields, and they hadn't realised that the hopper had run out of fertiliser, which led to half a field being fertilised, and these are oat plants, by the way, half a field being fertilised and half a field not being fertilised. So as you can see a very clear, distinct line down the farm there, down the field there, where the hopper had literally run out of nitrates, had run out of fertiliser. And therefore, this is all unfertilised. That's what you get with just what's in the soil, and this is what you get with actually adding fertiliser. So the difference is quite stark, quite dramatic. So why? What do they actually do? And this is where an A-level examiner would try and bring in different bits of the syllabus. They love to do this synoptic questioning, particularly in the A-level rather than the AS, and particularly in paper 3. They love to bring the biochemistry in with the cycles, in with the ecology, in with the physiology, everything. So nitrogen is, as we know, found in proteins and bases. So if you don't have that little nitrogen just there, you're not going to have any proteins, or you're going to have keto acid. And then we've got over here, look, here's a base, and here's a nucleotide rather, and this is the base. Okay, so that's got lots and lots of nitrogen in it there. Okay, that's where nitrogen is important. So without nitrates, plants don't grow. Without nitrogen in protein form, animals don't grow. Phosphorus, really important in nucleic acids over here, look. So you've got phosphorus over there, right, in the phosphate group of nucleic acids. You've also got phosphates in phospholipids. Down here, look, this is the phosphate group there. There's a bit of phosphorus there. Potassium is really important for movement in and out of cells. You might remember sodium-potassium pumps. And if you're really paying attention to how stomata open at GCSE, you'll remember the idea of actively moving potassium into cells to mess with water potential to make them swell up, right, so that the stomata open. It's also how plants generate root pressure and move water around before they've got leaves. Various things like that. So that's why potassium is really important. Magnesium is the prosthetic group, right? So it's the group that's not part of a normal sort of organic atom, if you like, and it sits in the middle here of chlorophyll. Okay, so that magnesium is really, really important in absorbing the light. So if plants don't get magnesium, they don't generate green chlorophyll and they look all yellow, right? Which again you should remember from GCSE. Okay, so that's the kind of things that these micronutrients do. So without any of these things, even though the absolute quantity might be very small, the job is very important. So how do we make sure that we end up with enough of these in the land? Well, this is where the bit on the syllabus talking about the costs and benefits comes in. You've got to add fertilizer, which of course you can't say without using my native accent. You've got to have fertilizers, right? You've got to have fertilizers on your field. Natural versions, of course, are manure, animal waste, other forms of waste product containing those nutrients. Artificial would be liquid, pellets, synthetic fertilizers. And you might well be asked to evaluate, to weigh up, balance the pros and the cons of each system. Okay? So let's look at each one in turn. So natural fertilizers basically involve the use of animal waste, plant waste, bone meal, leaf mold. So your compost heap at home, if you have one, is a way of making your own natural fertilizer. There are various other things gardeners do, like they grow a plant called comfrey, which sends down a big taproot, pulls loads of nutrients out of the soil, puts it in the leaf, and gardeners quite often will cut this down, put it in water, let it rot down a bit, and then use that as a plant feed. That's one way to do it. What we're seeing up here, this is a slurry pit, right, which is an awful smelling thing if you've ever been to a farm. So this is a cow shed over here. So the cows waste all their feces and urine and everything else gets hosed off downhill into this slurry pit here. So this slurry pit is basically a big silo of liquid animal waste, and some of the most appalling accidents I've ever heard of are people, and it happens a couple of times a year, that somebody falls into a slurry pit and drowns. And if you can think of a worse way to go than that, I would like to hear it. So they are obviously useful in that they're a store of these nitrates, they're a store of these phosphates, they're a store of everything that the animal is putting out in its waste. They are quite a dangerous addition to a farm in terms of both their hazard to the personnel, and also as decomposition takes place in them, they release a lot of methane, they release a lot of other gases into the atmosphere. Okay, you've also got a muck heap here. As you can see, this one you can see the decomposition taking place because the heat that's being generated is producing steam of this muck heap. So this one is what Nat Page was talking about in his conservation conversation, where you've got animals that are kept on straw. The straw is then pushed out into a big pile, and that pile is then, it just decomposes down, and all those nutrients stay put. And again, he spoke very wisely about putting a plastic covering over muck heaps, which stops some of the nutrients from escaping or being washed away. Okay, and he was surprised that a lot of farmers didn't do that. So, in terms of pros, what's good about the natural fertilizers? Well, they're generally solid, so they're unlikely to leach into water. So, if you've got muck and you spread it on a field, well, it's likely to stay there. It's not likely to go anywhere else, so you get the benefit of those nutrients. It keeps the levels of organic matter high in the soil, so it's enriching not just the raw nutrients in the soil, but the soil content, the organic carbon in the soil. The carbon levels are going up high, so you get higher quality soil. It's cheap if you've got the animals to make it. So if we've got a mixed farm, which has got animals and it's got crops, or you want to fertilise fields of grass for the animals to graze, well, then you've already got that resource there, the cowpats, the waste material, and you're not actually having to buy anything in from a supplier, so you're saving money. The cons, obviously, you can see immediately the issues with either a pool or a pile of animal waste. It's quite difficult to work with. Heavy, harder to spread, harder to transport, and also they've got a less consistent nutrient content. If you know, and farmers are this sophisticated, agriculturists are this sophisticated, precisely the phosphates and magnesium levels that their particular soil lacks to make optimal growth, what's to say that your particular slurry or muck is going to have those nutrients in those quantities, that you aren't overdoing it with the nitrogen and underdoing it with the calcium or the phosphorus or whatever it might be. Okay, so there's less consistency in the nutrient content and in being really precise about what nutrients go on. Okay, so that's natural fertilizers. In terms of artificial fertilizers, again, this verges on chemistry, so we're not going to spend too long here. Generally, artificial fertilizers are produced from the Haber process. If you don't know about Fritz Haber, he is a fascinating and tragic character who was a German Jew just up to the war. He was a brilliant chemist, no doubt, and he invented the Haber process, which was used not only to make fertilizers but to make bombs and explosives. So he actually managed to keep the German war effort going by a lot of his inventions, to the detriment of some indeed of his own family. So I would very much recommend you look into him. Also, his wife is fascinating as an early advocate of women in chemistry. She's fascinating as well, so I'd look into her. So with the fertilizers, you buy big bags of either pellets or liquid fertilizers. You can buy this as a gardener, or you can buy them in huge sacks as a commercial farmer. The pros of this: it's light, it's highly controlled, and very easy to spread onto the land. Okay, these materials. So by highly controlled, I mean you can literally specify, if you're an agriculturist, to your farmer, to your provider, which particular nutrients in what ratio you want in your fertilizer. Okay, you can be very, very lean. You can put just enough to get optimum growth, right? But it's hard to control leaching. They're prone, because they're liquid, to running away. It lowers the organic carbon content of the soil, leading to erosion, which we'll come on to in a moment. Okay, and again, you can look at the Haber process diagram in your own time. You won't be asked about that on the A-level biology spec, but it's a basic chemical process that I think all science students should know about. Right, so this is where we get to what we call NPK fertilizers. These artificial fertilizers are often referred to as NPK because they're the three main things that go into them: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay, they're highly customizable, as you can see on the far right over there. That bag has got specific ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in there that's been specified by the person who wants them. As you can see, the picture in the middle there is a picture I took in 2014 on a field course with students there, where we're being shown around a farm, and that is the farmer stood on top of his supply of NPK fertilizers. Now, this guy actually used both animal manure and NPK fertilizers to sort of top up, to try and get round that issue of the animal waste doesn't necessarily have a consistent nutrient content, so he would look at where the nutrients were weak, and he would top up with these chemical fertilizers. Okay, and this is a dairy farm. We're on here, they had a slurry pit, and actually, if you've ever had milk from Marks and Spencer's anywhere in Wales, it will have come from this farm. Okay, they've largely been produced indirectly by those fertilizers in the picture. Okay, so leaching is a problem, right? This is where we talk about the environmental issues caused by fertilizers. Leaching is a problem. Obviously, if you put liquid fertilizers onto a field and it rains, okay, they're going to run off into watercourses. Okay, now again, this shouldn't be news to you, but solids stay put. So manure in straw is more likely to stay put in the soil rather than liquid fertilizers, which are likely to wash away. That's bad news. Okay, we don't like things washing away. One, because the farmer doesn't get the benefit of the nutrients, they end up somewhere else, and they've paid for those nutrients. Two, because they end up in waterways or in other environments, and they mess up the nutrient balance in those environments. That's bad. Now in the UK, there are laws and there's best practice on verges, field margins, how we should be arranging our fields. So if you walk around a field, especially if it's close to a watercourse, you should see some lovely distance between the edge of the crop and the edge of the field, or the edge, especially the edge of the crop, verges onto a watercourse. Okay, so there shouldn't be nutrients running in there. We have verges, which hopefully, as any nutrient gets into them, they suck up the nutrients and turn into grass or flowers or whatever it might be, herbaceous borders, and then those can be controlled, mowed, trimmed, and turned into hay or feed or whatever point of the year. Okay, so if, however, nutrient fertilizers do get into, and often it's nitrogen that's talked about, do get into watercourses, they cause what's called eutrophication. And again, you should know this process. This was at GCSE and it's no different at A level. Okay, you do have to be very specific about about the wording that you use, but there we go. The process is exactly the same. So in whatever the context of a question might be, or the context of the environment, there's some kind of increase in nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, magnesium, whatever it is, that enters a watercourse. That causes an algal bloom, just like our iron example at the beginning. Okay, and that blocks out the sun because it grows across the top and it blocks out the sun. If you've ever seen a pond that's been highly polluted, you'll see that layer of algae across the top will block out the sun. That stops photosynthesis from the plants further down. Okay, and as we know, photosynthesis produces oxygen, and water does need to be oxygenated for stuff to live in it. Okay, the reduced amount of oxygen causes larger organisms, things higher up the food chain, to die. Okay, so they obviously suffer reduced oxygen, they suffer reduced fitness, they may well die as a result of that. The plants may also die because they're not getting the light. Then decay processes set in. Decay processes with bacteria lower the oxygen even more because they're respiring aerobically as it is. You get death, you get decay, and then once the oxygen is really, really, really low, you get your anaerobes kicking in, your anaerobic bacteria come along and do further decay process, produce all sorts of nasty byproducts, and that's called putrefaction. Okay, we would say the environment has become putrid at that point. The water has become putrid, and that basically means functionally, apart from maybe a few worms and these anaerobic bacteria, then we've got the death of the ecosystem. Obviously, the way to solve this: lower the nutrient content, remove the algae, and you'd be amazed at how quickly successional processes take place, secondary succession takes place, and you end up with the ecosystem bouncing back. Okay? But you need to stop putting the nutrients in there in the first place. So that's eutrophication. So here's some photos for you of a pond there on the right, a big lake there on the right that basically had a large nutrient burst. And as you can see, it went from sort of clear water to very murky, putrid death of the ecosystem. And you can see the algal bloom there on the left, right, popping up under the water. Okay, so that's eutrophication. Again, it shouldn't be used, but you do need to be able to explain the process. Okay, the other effect of heavy use of artificial fertilizers is erosion, because every time that you put nutrients in, grow a crop, of course you take the crop away. Okay, you harvest the crop and you take it away. That takes those nutrients, it takes the material away, it takes the carbon away, it takes everything else away. Okay, so every harvest takes nutrients away. Now you've got to then be responsible with your soil management and put those back. Okay, liquid fertilizers don't put back organic matter. Okay, they just don't. Okay, they put back the nutrients that you need, and they don't put carbon back into the soil because they're not carbon rich, and so on and so forth. If you repeat this over and over and over and over again, you put the nutrients in, you take the crop away. You put the nutrients, you take the crop away. Particularly the levels of carbon in the soil go down and down and down and down and down and down until all that you're left with really is either clay or sand, and it's pretty much inert. And that essentially is a desert. Okay, that's not great. You know, well, we'll keep putting the nutrients back in, brilliant. But then it becomes more easily weathered. If there's not that organic matter to hold the soil together, it becomes more easily weathered. So wind will take that away. It takes the topsoil away. You get erosion off the topsoil. Farming gets less efficient, it gets more costly because obviously the more this happens, the more nutrients you have to pay to put back in, and eventually it becomes unsustainable, and all that's happened is you've turned an area of the planet into a desert. As you can see, these two examples over here, the bottom one there is from China. As you can see, that desertification is encroaching into that heavily farmed land, essentially they're having to fall back and fall back and fall back from where they can now viably farm. Okay, so it's not a good thing. So in the short term, again, this is GCSE standard stuff. In the short term, if you do heavy inputs of nutrients, your yield might go up, but in the long term it goes down. So the economic model is not sustainable. Okay, so well, you probably heard about this. Why don't we all go organic? Because I'm talking to a group of people who generally their nearest supermarket is Waitrose, so and they're quite high end organic, all that kind of stuff with vegetables that agreed to be in the packets in the first place, that kind of stuff. What do we mean by organic farming? Well, there are various organisations that certify your farm as organic or your food as organic, and the sort of most famous, largest one of those is probably the Soil Association. Okay, and what they look for is no off-farm inputs. So they look for your farm to be as self-contained as possible. Some people say there's no chemicals in the food. Oh, we don't put any chemicals in the food. Well, that's nonsense. Everything's made of chemicals. You're made of chemicals. I'm made of chemicals. Crocodiles, alligators, Ebola are made of chemicals, right? Everything is chemicals. So that's not a helpful definition. What we're looking then for is no off-farm inputs. Okay, higher quality food results from this, right? If you've got organically managed soil and you've got sort of growing this, if you like, in a slower and more natural way, more like the natural situation, you get a better nutrient density. Okay, if you're not putting any sort of growth stimulants onto plants and you're not putting any artificial nutrients there, then you get better nutrient density, right? You get more nutrients per gram, so therefore organic food is undoubtedly, if you cook it correctly, it's undoubtedly healthier for you. Okay. However, if you cook it like your nan does the sprouts at Christmas, where you boil the vegetables for half an hour so they go that lovely grey colour, and you lose all the nutrients to the water, well, the difference is much of a muchness. On the other side, though, because you're taking more time to grow these crops or animals, you get a lower yield per square metre of farm. Okay, you can get fewer crops per year because they're not growing as quickly. Okay. Therefore, the resultant crop for the farmer to make a profit is more expensive. Okay, so the big question about organic farming is, if we all switch to an organic farming lifestyle, would there be enough food? And the answer to that is complicated. The answer to that is not straightforward. We waste a third of our food as it is. Okay, we waste a third of it, we basically put it straight in the bin. So food waste is a huge issue. If we were able to not waste that third of the food, we would need a third less food, and that would kind of compensate for the reduced yields in terms of the organic method. But that would require everybody to know how to cook correctly and not waste their food. Okay? And that obviously is a big cultural shift. We've also got the issue that lots of people don't know how to prepare their food well. Right? They don't know how to keep nutrient contents high in food when they're preparing it, and a lot of people don't cook for themselves at all. Now, it would be more expensive. They would go into the supermarket, they'd look at a bag of vegetables, organic versus not organic, and they see that as much more expensive, and probably go for the cheaper one. Okay? And who can blame them? But we in this country spend so little money in terms of our percentage of our income on our food, okay, compared to other European countries and other countries around the world, that actually I think we could probably afford to change our mindset. But it is about changing mindsets. It is about changing the idea, and it is largely down to the supermarkets that we have such a downward pressure on food costs, because they're all competing with each other, which puts a pressure on the farmers to produce more food more cheaply. Okay, and at the moment we're in big debates about whether or not we should let American imports into the country in terms of food, and in terms of their food quality and their food standards. The answer to that, from my own reading of the science, is unequivocally no. We should not do that. Their food standards are a lot lower than ours, and if you've ever been to America, the food quality is not as high as ours, and it would be a big problem. So in terms of could we all live entirely organically, there's no simple answer. The answer is, if we changed our mindset on how much food should cost us, we changed our mindset on cooking, and we changed our mindset on waste, 100% yes, we could. And I think that's something we all should do. Whether we will do that, I don't know. Okay, that's another one that could be debated by sociologists, economists, and philosophers from now until forever. Okay, so if you want to listen more on this, hopefully you've already done this if you've seen this video go up. Episode 3 of Conservation Conversations is with an organic beef farmer called Nat Page, who is go listen to him. He has far more expertise on this than I do. So if you go listen to his conversations, he talks extensively about the use of fertilizers, soil quality, so on and so forth. He's the expert, so do go and listen to that if you've not done so already. Now, if I might, just before we finish, put my careers hat on for a moment. There's the careers hat. There are loads of jobs going, and at the moment, this is a time where we really need jobs for young people. There are loads of jobs going, and they're not just the typical kind of things you're thinking about in farming, okay, in agriculture, in food production, and they are increasingly technical and increasingly high tech. Okay, the amount of robotics, AI, the amount of biochemistry, the amount of high-level geography and so on and so forth coming into farming in the modern world is huge. But it can be quite a difficult industry to get into because people tend to get born into it, farming communities, as it were. But there are lots and lots of jobs, and I'm not just talking fruit pickers and people who go and plough fields and dig things up, although that is unequivocally an aspect of it. Right? There are huge numbers of jobs going. So some of the weirder ones that I found, right, look like this. Okay, so you've got increasing food lawyers, international food trades, mycologists looking at fungi, urban farming, food technologists, and fermentation scientists. All are within the food production sphere. So if this kind of thing interests you, the applied biochemistry, the application of a lot of the biology, geography, and economics that you might have learnt, then maybe having a look at a career path within food production or within agriculture is a worthwhile thing to do, because we absolutely need it. I mean, what could be more important really than the food that we eat? Okay, and on that note, I'll say goodbye, and that's the last lesson for this academic year. So if I don't see you, have a lovely summer.